The cameras were already rolling when Kash Patel leaned forward, his tone dripping with smug certainty. He thought he had the upper hand, thought this was just another chance to dominate the airwaves. His words sliced through the studio like a practiced blade, sharp and dismissive, a jab not just at Jasmine Crockett, but at everything she represented. The audience tensed. Some leaned back, uncomfortable. Others leaned in, waiting to see how she would respond. Then freeze. The moment hangs, suspended. Nobody expected what came next. The studio lights bore down, casting everything into stark contrast. Patel's smirk glistened under the glare, a mask of arrogance rehearsed 1,000 times before. Across from him, Crockett sat still, her expression unreadable, her body language calm. It was the quiet before a storm, and everyone in that room could feel the air shift. The moderator hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. A few gasps scattered through the crowd. Phones lit up in the back rows, viewers already preparing to clip whatever happened next. Because in this age of instant virality, one exchange can define a career, an identity, even a movement. And tonight, that moment had arrived. Crockett's lips curled, not in anger, but in something more dangerous to a man like Patel: amusement. She tilted her head slightly, a faint smile breaking across her face, as though she knew something he didn't. As though she was already 5 moves ahead on a chessboard. Patel hadn't even realized he was playing. The contrast was cinematic. Patel, all bravado and noise, mistaking bluster for strength. Crockett, silent and steady, letting the weight of his words hang in the air until they collapsed under their own arrogance. The audience could feel it. A rumble of anticipation spread like a current building before lightning strikes. What was she about to say? What was she about to do? The camera zoomed closer, searching for every flicker of expression, every twitch, every hint of the storm about to break. And Crockett gave nothing away, just that knowing smile. The kind of smile that says, "You've already lost. And you don't even realize it yet. In the next 15 seconds, the room's balance of power would flip. This wasn't just another debate. Another evening of soundbites tossed into the furnace of America's endless news cycle. No, this was a stage set at the height of partisan warfare, where every word could ripple through millions of homes, where every look, every pause, every spark of defiance was destined to be dissected on cable panels and blasted across social media feeds. The country was already fractured along raw fault lines: race, power, belonging, truth itself. And here on this night, those divides had a face on either side of the table. Kash Patel walked into that room with the confidence of a seasoned insider, a former operative, a Washington regular, someone who had spent years maneuvering in the shadows of power. His reputation wasn't built on humility or fairness, it was built on sharp elbows, relentless loyalty to his side, and the smug assurance that he could talk down anyone who challenged him. To Patel, the debate wasn't about dialogue. It was about domination. And as the cameras flashed to his practiced smirk, he believed he was already winning. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett. To the untrained eye, she might have looked like the underdog. Younger, newer to the national spotlight. A woman who carried not just her voice but the weight of generations underestimated, dismissed, and silenced. Patel thought that gave him an advantage. But what he couldn't see, what he refused to see, was that Crockett's sharpness had been honed long before these bright lights. She had faced courtrooms, constituents, and critics who doubted her worth, and she had risen every time. Her calm now wasn't weakness. It was calculation. The stakes were higher than any one exchange. 2 million watching. This wasn't Patel versus Crockett. It was arrogance versus dignity. Old guard versus new fire. A test of whether truth could stand tall against sneering dismissal, and the atmosphere reflected it. The crowd leaned forward, sensing the electricity. The moderator fumbled to keep order, already losing grip, as the clash intensified. Social media threads buzzed in real time, each side claiming their champion, waiting for the defining blow. The tension wasn't just in the studio. It was in living rooms, on phones, in the beating hearts of viewers who saw themselves reflected in Crockett's poise or Patel's arrogance. Millions didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness a turning point. The kind of moment that lives longer than a headline, the kind of clash replayed in classrooms, campaign ads, and whispered conversations at kitchen tables. But first came the provocation. Patel wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, his voice dripping with the kind of casual disdain only years of unchecked arrogance could perfect. His words weren't just sharp. They were designed to humiliate, to belittle, to remind everyone in the room that he thought he owned the narrative. The silence that followed was heavy. The audience shifted, some eyes narrowing, some mouths tightening. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, capturing the smugness that Patel mistook for triumph. And yet across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She let the insult hang in the air. Let it echo. Let it reveal more about him than it ever could about her. The faintest trace of that knowing smile returned, but her eyes sharpened. She was waiting, calculating, preparing to strike with precision. But before Crockett could strike, Patel doubled down to understand Kash Patel's swagger that night. You have to step back into the world that built him. For years, he had maneuvered behind the curtains of Washington, mastering the art of proximity to power. He wasn't a man who rose by sheer brilliance or by moral vision. No, Patel climbed by attaching himself to larger figures, speaking their language, amplifying their fire, and delivering what they wanted most. Someone willing to play the bulldog. Someone unafraid to throw elbows. Someone who could smear, provoke, and distract with a grin. And in that arena, Patel thrived. He developed a reputation not for substance, but for style, a brash, combative energy that thrilled allies and enraged opponents. His words were often polished, delivered with the cadence of someone who had practiced in the mirror. He knew how to sound sharp, how to dress his talking points in the armor of authority. Yet beneath the polish was something thinner, something fragile. His arguments rarely carried weight beyond the room. But for Patel, weight wasn't the goal. Noise was. Noise, spectacle, disruption, that was how he won. Cameras became his stage, and arrogance his costume. He strutted through hearings, press hits, and cable debates as though they were coronations. To his supporters, he projected fearlessness. To his critics, he embodied every stereotype of the insider who mistakes volume for wisdom. But to Patel, the critics didn't matter. As long as he drew blood, as long as his opponent faltered, he could claim victory. That night in the studio, his persona was on full display. He leaned forward with the air of a man convinced of his own dominance, every gesture rehearsed, every smirk calculated. He believed this was another chance to humiliate, to push an opponent into silence. Because silence, to him, was victory. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't realize, was that swagger can only carry a man so far. When stripped of the smirk, when pressed beyond the talking points, substance begins to matter. And Patel had never been forced to go toe-to-toe with someone who refused to play his game. The contradictions within him began to show. He spoke with certainty, yet his logic often spiraled into circular defenses. He claimed truth, yet twisted facts until they bent under the weight of spin. He called himself fearless, yet leaned heavily on the power structures behind him, drawing strength not from his own courage but from his alignment with those higher up the ladder still. Patel carried himself as though untouchable. He had silenced others before. He had turned critics into caricatures, painted them into corners, left them rattled and searching for words. He was skilled at making opponents question themselves, skilled at flooding the air with so much noise that the audience couldn't find the signal. He knew how to talk over people, how to cut in, how to laugh dismissively, until the sting landed harder than any argument. It was a performance he had perfected. A performance that gave him confidence as he squared off against Jasmine Crockett. He believed this night would be no different. Another debate, another chance to win by sheer bluster, another opponent he could bury under his well-practiced act. But the arrogance blinded him. What Patel mistook for fear in Crockett's silence was calculation. What he thought was dominance was simply noise, waiting to collapse. Because against someone with both substance and composure, swagger doesn't intimidate, it exposes. And so, while Patel leaned back, basking in his own bravado. The stage lights caught every flicker of his expression. To the audience at home, something was beginning to crack. The longer he spoke, the more his contradictions shone through. The rhetoric was polished, yes, but the foundation was weak. His words rattled with hollow bravado. In that moment, he didn't see it. He thought he had already won. He thought the cameras loved him, that the audience was on his side, that history would record yet another moment of him towering over an opponent. But history had other plans. Because the opponent in front of him wasn't backing. Down to understand why Jasmine Crockett sat so calmly across from Patel that night. Why she carried herself with that quiet confidence that unnerved him. You have to know where she came from. Hers is not the story of someone handed a microphone or ushered into power by elite connections. Hers is the story of someone who fought for every inch of ground she stood on, long before the studio lights and the viral clips. Crockett was a lawyer who spent her days in the trenches, fighting for those who didn't have a voice, defending the vulnerable, and standing up against a system that was never designed to make things easy for people like her. Courtrooms became her battlefield. Every day, she faced prosecutors, judges, and skeptics who looked at her not as a sharp legal mind, but as a young black woman they thought they could dismiss. And dismiss her they tried. Time and again, Crockett walked into rooms where the odds were stacked, where she was underestimated before she had even spoken. She knew the double standards that clung to her like a shadow. When she raised her voice, she was angry. When she pressed too hard, she was difficult, yet she never let those labels define her. Instead, she turned them into fuel, sharpening her arguments until they cut like glass. Those who watched her work in the courtroom began to notice something different. Yes, she was fierce, but she was also surgical. She didn't waste words. She didn't flail wildly. She waited, listened, and then struck at exactly the right moment. Her opponents rarely saw it coming. One minute they thought they had her cornered. The next, they were left scrambling as she dismantled their case, piece by piece. That was her gift, composure, and timing. Crockett learned early that she didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. She just needed to be the sharpest. And while others relied on bluster, she relied on precision. But the courtroom wasn't her only arena. Crockett carried that same fire into activism, into the streets, into communities where promises were too often broken. She listened to the stories of families who had been ignored, of people who had been written off. In their voices, she heard echoes of her own struggles, and she resolved to turn her platform into their megaphone. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had been told they didn't belong, everyone who had been talked over, everyone who had been belittled into silence. Her voice became, in the words of one commentator, the voice of those dismissed, belittled, underestimated. And that voice carried weight. It wasn't polished in the way Washington insiders liked to polish themselves. It was real, raw, and backed by lived experience. That authenticity gave her power. Still, she knew what she was up against. Every room she entered came with an invisible test. Prove yourself again, and again, and again. Where others were granted authority by default, she had to wrestle it from clenched fists. Where others were assumed competent, she had to outshine just to break even. But instead of being broken down by those double standards, she mastered the art of rising above them. She turned the very act of being underestimated into a weapon. And that's what Patel didn't understand. He looked across the table and saw someone he thought he could steamroll. He saw a youth where there was experience, composure where there was strategy. He mistook her silence for weakness, not realizing it was the silence of a predator watching, waiting for the perfect opening, because Crockett wasn't just sharp, she was witty. She knew how to cut not only with facts, but with humor, with perfectly timed barbs that exposed arrogance for what it was. Those who followed her career knew that when she smiled in the middle of a tense exchange, it wasn't because she was rattled. It was because she had already seen the line she was about to deliver. That night, as Patel leaned on his bravado, Crockett carried with her the lessons of every courtroom. Every protest, every time someone tried to shut her down, she carried the weight of her constituents, her community, the countless others who saw themselves reflected in her resilience. She knew this was more than a debate. This was a stage where millions were watching, where one exchange could become a symbol. She didn't need to win with volume. She didn't need to outshout Patel. All she needed was to wait, steady and patient, until his arrogance gave her the opening she needed. And when that moment came, she would wield it with surgical precision. The first jab had landed, but Patel wasn't finished. He could feel the cameras on him, feeding the energy he thrived on. He leaned back in his chair, chuckling low, as if to say the contest was already decided. His words dripped with condescension, the tone of a man who believed his years in Washington, his proximity to power, gave him license to speak down to anyone, especially to someone he believed didn't belong on the same stage. "People like you," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand, "just don't understand how this game is played. Leave the serious work to the professionals." The insult cut deeper than the words themselves. It wasn't just an attack on Crockett. It was an attack on everyone watching who had ever been told they weren't qualified, weren't experienced enough, weren't the right kind of person to have a voice. The audience shifted uncomfortably. A murmur spread through the crowd. The kind of sound that grows when people aren't sure whether to gasp or to laugh. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to match his volume or his bravado. Instead, she sat still, eyes fixed on him, every inch of her body language controlled. Her calm became its own form of resistance, and that calm unnerved Patel more than any shouted rebuttal could have. So he pressed harder. His voice rose, confident, rehearsed. He layered insult on top of insult, dismissing her credentials, mocking her perspective, painting her as naive. He leaned forward now, punctuating his words with sharp gestures meant to dominate the space between them. Every sentence was meant to box her in, to corner her into either silence or outrage. But the more he spoke, the more he revealed himself. The smugness became too thick, the arrogance too obvious. What he thought was strength began to sound like desperation, the rant of a man desperate to cling to control. The insult landed heavy. But the silence that followed was heavier. The audience felt it. Phones hovered in the air, ready to record. The moderator looked between them, sensing a shift, sensing the tension cresting like a wave about to crash. Even Patel, for all his bravado, paused for just a split second, as though some part of him realized he might have gone too far. And then came the smallest movement. A smile, tugging at the corner of Crockett's lips. She leaned back slightly as though to absorb the weight of his words, and then leaned forward again, eyes locked on his. The crowd stilled. The cameras tightened their frame. It was as if the entire room collectively held its breath. For the first time, Patel's smirk faltered, if only by a hair, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't rattled. She wasn't silenced. She had been waiting, letting him build his tower of arrogance higher and higher, knowing that when she finally spoke, it would take only one strike to bring it crashing down. Then Crockett leaned forward and unleashed. The silence stretched, long enough for everyone to feel it settle into their bones. Patel thought he had cornered her. He thought his jabs had landed, that his sneering dismissal had ended the exchange before it truly began. But Jasmine Crockett had been waiting. Timing was everything, and this was her moment. She leaned forward, eyes steady, smile unbroken. And when she finally spoke, the room shifted. "You know, Mr. Patel," she began, her voice calm, but edged with steel. "It's funny. You've spent all this time bragging about how the game is played. But the only thing you've shown tonight is that you can't win without trying to. Belittle people." The words cut through the studio like a blade. Sharp, clean, undeniable. The audience gasped. Patel blinked, his smirk faltering for the first time. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm delivery made the lines sting harder, like a precise strike instead of a wild swing. She didn't stop there. "You call yourself a professional," she continued, each word landing like a measured blow. "But professionals don't need to talk down to others to prove their worth. Professionals have substance. Professionals have truth. And if you had either, you wouldn't be wasting everyone's time trying to cover it with smugness." Patel opened his mouth, searching for a response, but no sound came. He blinked again, his lips parting and closing like a man caught off guard in the very arena he thought he commanded. The lights that once seemed to crown him now burned hot, exposing every flicker of doubt in his face. Crockett pressed forward, seizing the silence. "I may not play the game the way you do," she said, her voice rising just slightly, enough to ride the wave of anticipation in the room. "But maybe that's because I'm not here to play games. I'm here to tell the truth. I'm here to fight for people who are tired of insiders like you acting like America belongs only to them." The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, even laughter spilled through the studio. The dam had broken, and the energy was all hers. People rose from their seats clapping, hollering, some even stomping their feet. Phones shot upward, recording the very moment they knew would explode online within minutes. Patel's smirk collapsed entirely, replaced by a stiff, uncomfortable stillness. Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned back, letting the audience's roar wash over the stage, and then, with perfect timing, added the final strike. "So if you think dismissing me makes you look strong," she said, her tone cutting but almost playful now, "all it really does is remind everyone watching that you've got nothing left to stand on." Boom. A collective gasp, followed by a wave of laughter so loud the moderator had to raise his hand for order. Hashtags began forming in real time. Hashtag Crockett clap back. Hashtag mic drop. Hashtag Patel shook. Twitter feeds lit up like fireworks. Crockett just ended him on live TV. That's how you dismantle arrogance with dignity. Patel brought noise. Crockett brought substance. Game over. The power dynamic had flipped completely. Only minutes earlier, Patel seemed untouchable, the insider with confidence radiating from his every gesture. Now he sat there faltering, blinking too much, his fingers fidgeting against the desk as if searching for something solid to hold on to. His silence was louder than any insult he could have hurled. Crockett, by contrast, was radiant in her composure. She didn't gloat. She didn't shout. She simply sat, eyes calm, smile unwavering, as though she had been here 100 times before. The crowd's energy swelled around her, feeding her presence, amplifying her victory without her needing to lift a finger. And outside the studio, the reaction was immediate. Clips of the exchange spread across platforms within minutes. TikTok loops replayed her opening line. "The only thing you've shown tonight is that you can't win without trying to belittle people." Twitter turned her smile into a meme. Captions like, "When you know, you're about to end his whole career," plastered across screenshots. On Instagram, celebrities reposted the moment with fire emojis and captions like, "Queen energy." Commentators jumped in too. One late-night host tweeted, "Patel brought a knife. Crockett brought a scalpel. And wow, did she know how to use it." Political analysts scrambled to spin it, some praising Patel for holding his ground, but even their voices wavered, drowned out by the sheer volume of celebration surrounding Crockett's clapback in living rooms across the country.
Viewers felt a jolt of recognition.
They saw themselves in Crockett, the kid talked over in class, the worker dismissed in meetings, the neighbor ignored until their patience wore thin. Her words weren't just for her. They were for everyone who had been underestimated, belittled, silenced. And when she spoke with that mix of calm and conviction, it was as if she was finally giving them the comeback they had always wanted to deliver. Meanwhile, Patel sat frozen, a man undone not by shouting or chaos, but by precision. His arrogance had built him up, but Crockett's dignity had dismantled him piece by piece. And the cameras caught it all, the falter in his eyes, the flush in his cheeks, the way he tried to mask his discomfort with a forced grin that only made his defeat more obvious. The balance of power in the room had shifted permanently. Crockett had taken the reins, and Patel was left scrambling in silence. His empire of swagger had collapsed in seconds under the weight of a single, undeniable truth. Dignity doesn't need to shout. The audience knew they had just witnessed something bigger than a comeback. This wasn't just a viral moment. It was a cultural one. It was proof that arrogance can crumble in an instant, that poise and substance can triumph even in the noisiest arenas. And yet, the real shockwaves were only beginning. The clip didn't just travel, it detonated. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, Crockett's mic drop moment was everywhere. Twitter feeds scrolled endlessly with replay after replay, each new angle clipped and captioned with fresh fire. On TikTok, teenagers were lip-syncing her lines by morning, turning her words into punchlines for skits, duets, and remixes. Instagram flooded with reels set to triumphant background music. Slow-motion edits capturing the exact second Patel's smirk evaporated. Asterisk. The hashtags exploded. Hashtag Crockett clapback hit the trending board within the hour. Followed closely by hashtag Patel shook and hashtag dignity wins. By midnight, hashtag mic drop queen had gone viral too. Each post carried the same message. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended herself, she had delivered the comeback of the year. Celebrities joined in. One A-list actor tweeted a still frame of Crockett's smile with the caption, "This belongs in a museum." A chart-topping musician posted, "This is why we need voices like hers in politics." Absolute queen. Even athletes chimed in, quoting her lines before their games as if reciting motivational chants. Meanwhile, commentators across the political spectrum scrambled to interpret what had happened. Progressive outlets celebrated, framing Crockett's takedown as not just a personal victory, but a symbolic rejection of arrogance and insider elitism. Cable news replayed the exchange on loop, anchors dissecting every glance and pause, as though analyzing championship game footage. Even conservative pundits, some clearly rattled, tried to spin the moment, insisting Patel had been ambushed or that Crockett had been too rehearsed, but their defenses rang hollow. Drowned out by the avalanche of applause from every corner of social media, Patel's defenders struggled. They wrote think pieces arguing that he had been taken out of context. They flooded comment sections with excuses, claiming the audience had been biased, that the moderators had failed, that the whole thing was unfair. But excuses never trend. Memes do. And the memes were brutal. Screenshots of Patel's stunned face became reaction images overnight. When you realize the clapback is stronger than your whole career, his blinking silence was looped endlessly on GIFs, paired with captions like buffering and system error, confidence not found. Crockett, on the other hand, became a symbol. For many, she wasn't just Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman and attorney. She was every underestimated voice rising against dismissal. Her moment was reframed in articles and op-eds as the embodiment of resilience. The immigrant child told they didn't belong. The young professional brushed aside in meetings. The woman labeled too much for daring to speak with conviction. She became in that instant more than herself. She became an archetype of triumph against arrogance. In communities across the country, watch parties replayed the clip. Families laughed, clapped, some even cried. In barbershops and classrooms, people debated the exact line that hit hardest. For some, it was the opening. The only thing you've shown tonight is that you can't win without trying to belittle people. For others, it was the closing strike. All it really does is remind everyone watching that you've got nothing left to stand on. But for everyone, the moment felt like a release of years of frustration at being ignored. Sneered at, written off, even the press acknowledged it. One headline read, "Crockett turns arrogance into ashes." Another, "The clapback heard around the nation." Analysts predicted the exchange would follow Patel for the rest of his career, shadowing every future appearance with the ghost of that silence, that faltering blink, that unraveling grin. But for Crockett, the resonance went deeper. She hadn't just landed a comeback. She had reframed the conversation itself. By staying composed, by striking with precision instead of fury. She had modeled a different kind of power, one rooted in dignity, in a landscape often dominated by shouting matches and chaos. She had proven that stillness could be louder than noise, that wit could be sharper than bluster. And that struck a chord. Across comment sections and interviews, people weren't just praising her words, they were celebrating what she represented. That's what strength looks like. She stood tall for all of us. This is more than politics. This is pride, asterisk. The wildfire of her moment wasn't slowing. If anything, it was spreading wider, pulling in those who might never have paid attention otherwise. Patel had walked onto that stage thinking he could reduce her to a footnote. Instead, she had written herself into history, because this wasn't just about a comeback, it was about a cultural reset. When the dust settled, when the trending hashtags began to cool and the studio lights dimmed, something larger remained. It wasn't just that Jasmine Crockett had landed a flawless comeback. It was that she had turned an insult designed to diminish her into a source of empowerment. What Patel meant as a weapon became the very thing that lifted her higher. That reversal, elegant transformation, is where the lesson lives. In a political era saturated with noise, arrogance often masquerades as strength. Shouting becomes strategy, smugness parades as certainty. But Crockett's moment revealed the flaw in that approach. Arrogance has no foundation. It is loud, but hollow. Sharp, but brittle. And when it meets dignity real, grounded dignity, it collapses under its own weight. The narrator's voice frames it simply. Dignity is always greater than arrogance, truth always greater than noise. What Crockett demonstrated wasn't just quick wit or legal sharpness. It was the quiet power of someone who knows who she is, who carries the weight of lived struggle. Who doesn't need to raise her volume because her presence alone commands the room. Her story ties to something universal. How many people watching had been dismissed in classrooms, belittled in workplaces, underestimated in boardrooms? How many had been told, directly or indirectly, that they didn't belong, that their voice didn't matter? Crockett's clapback wasn't just a political highlight. It was a mirror reflecting the resilience of millions who have had to fight for their place, who have learned to turn underestimation into fuel. And in that moment, she wasn't only speaking for herself. She was speaking for the child of immigrants carrying two cultures on their shoulders. For the woman in a male-dominated room forced to prove herself twice over. For the community activists told they were too loud until history vindicated them. Crockett's words echoed like a collective exhale. Proof that composure and timing can pierce through even the most polished arrogance. The takeaway for the audience is clear. When arrogance rises, it always collapses before dignity. Arrogance feeds on intimidation, but dignity is unshakable. Arrogance thrives on spectacle, but dignity survives in silence. And when the two clash, dignity doesn't just endure, it triumphs. That's why her moment resonated so deeply. Why it felt larger than one debate, larger than two figures trading barbs on live television. It symbolized a shift, however brief, in the balance of power. It reminded viewers that the stage doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the truest one. Crockett reframed Patel's jab into a lasting lesson. Insults can be recycled into inspiration. Disrespect into resilience, arrogance into ashes. She showed that you don't need to outshout your opponent to outshine them. You only need to stand firm, smile knowingly, strike when it matters. The nation will forget 100 debates, 1,000 sound bites. But the moments that live on are the ones that transcend politics and touch something timeless, justice, pride, dignity. Crockett's clapback belongs to that rare category, and that's why this moment won't be forgotten. A savage insult meant to demean became a comeback for the ages. What was supposed to be Patel's triumph turned into Crockett's crowning moment. A reminder that arrogance always underestimates dignity and always pays the price for it. One smug jab on live television unraveled into a cultural flashpoint, replayed, remixed, and remembered as the instant a quiet smile proved louder than 1,000 shouts. But here's the thing. This isn't just Jasmine Crockett's story. It's yours too. Every time you've been told to sit down, to quiet yourself, to accept less than your worth, her moment stands as proof that you don't have to. That dignity doesn't bend to arrogance. That resilience can flip the balance of power in a heartbeat. Think of what it means when millions watch a single moment, see themselves reflected in it. That's not just politics. That's identity. That's pride. And it's why stories like this matter, because they remind us that the fight for respect, for justice, for visibility is shared. So if this moment moved you, If it made you laugh, cheer, or even breathe a little easier, don't just watch it, be part of it. Subscribe to the channel, share this story, and join the conversation. Because every time you amplify voices like Crockett's, you're helping rewrite the narrative, one clapback, one comeback, one act of dignity at a time. And never forget the lesson that rang clear from that stage. When dignity stands tall, arrogance always falls. Asterisk.